Good morning. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone here in-house to make that final courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our program today is Hella Dale, Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. She focuses on the U.S. government's institutions and programs for strategic outreach to the public of foreign countries, as well as more traditional diplomacy. She is a Media Fellow at the Hoover Institution. She serves on the Board of Visitors at the Institute of Political Journalism and the Center for Free Inquiry at Hanover College, and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming Hella Dale. Hella?
Thank you, John. Thank you to our audience for being here today for this important program, and thank you very much to our keynote speaker for joining us today. Wednesday, tomorrow, September 11th, marks the 12th anniversary of the al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington. It also marks the one-year anniversary of the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, which left, tragically, Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans dead, and sent the Obama administration scrambling for explanations and a cover story, but unfortunately not justice for the guilty. New information about the administration's actions before and after the attacks have been revealed since then through congressional testimony and whistleblowers and eyewitnesses. Yet nothing has been done really to bring the guilty to justice. So we want to make sure here at the Heritage Foundation with you today to ensure that we do not forget what happened, that the investigations continue, that we continue to honor the memory of those who died, and to rekindle our passion for finding the truth. We're also today now looking at Syria as a potential battlefield, as a problem, international problem, as a conundrum for the Obama administration. All of these things are somehow connected in a Middle East that has seen an unfortunate absence of U.S. policy and leadership. So I want to welcome and to thank the Honorable Alan West for joining us today. He is going to be our keynote speaker. He has offered, after his remarks, to take some questions, and after that we will have a panel discussion with 3 noted experts. He served for 22 years in the U.S. Army before being elected to the U.S. House of Representatives by Florida's 22nd District. And as we all know, throughout his time in Congress, Alan West consistently stood for policies that would make the United States prosperous, strong, and free, speaking up even when it is not easy. In January of 2013, he joined PJ Media as a director of Next Generation Programming, where he's leading the effort to develop new internet shows and other media to be viewed by the next generation of Americans, drawing them into the issues of the day that are important. He holds a Master's of Military Arts and Sciences from the U.S. Army Command and General Staff Officer College in Political Theory and Military Operations. And I'm going to stop here and just say I'm so incredibly pleased that you could be here today. Over to you.
Well, I want to thank Hallie for having me here, and thanks each and every one of you for being here, and especially thank the Heritage Foundation for allowing me to share some thoughts and perspectives on, the 1 year since Benghazi. But really, I want to start and give a little history lesson, because it was George Santayana who said back in 1920s that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If you want to talk about and understand the things that are happening in the Middle East, there's a great book that you should go back and read, The Guns of August, which talks about how the world stumbled into World War I. If you don't want to read read The Guns of August, read John Keegan's First World War. And what I'm talking about is how a series of uncontrollable events, miscalculations, can all of a sudden lead to something that you did not expect, a world war. And when I think about what is happening in Syria, the discussions that we're having right now, you cannot talk about Syria unless you talk about what occurred in Libya. Because what occurred in Libya was absolutely astonishing. And that a president, and if anyone had told me before I came to Congress that I would stand shoulder to shoulder with Dennis Kucinich on an issue, I would have said, that's not going to happen. But Dennis Kucinich and I stood on principle on an issue, and that was involvement and intervention in Libya. Because one of the things that the military always teaches you, before you go into any type of operation, you want to sit back and you want to go through a decision synchronization matrix. You want to think about your action. You want to think about the reaction of the adversary. And then you want to think about your counteraction. Because always remember, the enemy has a vote. And most times we will tell you that a plan works only as well until you run into first contact. But at least you need to have some semblance of a plan. But what Dennis Kucinich and I sat back and we looked at what was happening in Libya, we did not have a plan. And interestingly enough, the president did not ask for congressional approval to go into Libya. And as I sat there in the House Armed Services Committee and we had the testimonies, the number one thing that I asked, who are the rebels? What are their goals? What are their intentions? What are their backgrounds? Who's supplying them? Well, we're not really sure. We would continue to get from, Department of Defense officials, State Department officials that were coming to testify before us. And I was thinking, okay, so now we're going to go in and we're going to rent out our air and naval power to an entity that we're not sure who they are, we're not sure of their goals and objectives, but we just believe that there is a potential for a huge human casualty that's going to occur. What are you thinking about as far as the unintended consequences, the second and third order effects and events? And they did not know. So we did. We went into Libya. We went beyond the 90 days of the War Powers Act, which, of course, is a violation of our law. No one's talking about that. And we deposed Muammar Gaddafi. Now, Muammar Gaddafi was not an angel. Let's be very honest about that. But Muammar Gaddafi was manageable. The thing is, sometimes it is better to keep the devil that you know than to get the devil that you don't know. And that's exactly what happened in Libya. The devil that we did not know, the devil that was telling us who they were, basically, was Al-Qaeda. Ansar al-Sharia, the leader of Ansar al-Sharia, had been recently released from Guantanamo Bay. And we didn't figure that out. All the indicators and warnings were there. We had just recently killed the number 2 in Al-Qaeda. And there were communiques that were intercepted saying that they're going to go for retribution. They're going to go for attacks. Well, no one paid attention to the intelligence indicators and warning signs. But what was even more interesting is this. Having served in combat zones, during the 9/11 day, I can tell you that high-value targets that we want to protect, generals don't move around on 9/11 because we know that that's a very special day for the other side, to gain a victory, to have a big kill. So you have to ask yourself, who was it and why was Ambassador Chris Stevens sent into Benghazi, Libya on September the 11th? Then you have to ask yourself why, after the series of attacks that had gone on, the Red Crescent had pulled out, the International Red Cross had pulled out, the British ambassador had an RPG attack, he had left. Why would we send our ambassador into an area where the black Al-Qaeda flag was prominently flying? And then we would give him Islamist militia as his security. So, once again, the unintended consequences. You go in, you overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, you don't understand who's going to take over. But realize that this enemy, the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, all of these different forces, Hezbollah, Hamas, they're always looking for the confused, chaotic situation. Being in Somalia, being in Sudan, being in Libya, being in Mali, being in Syria, where they can come in and they can rise to power. They can rise to control. So all of a sudden, because of the fact that we didn't pay attention to indicators and warnings, all of a sudden we put our ambassador into harm's way. And even after the ambassador sends in the message to Mr. Joe Hicks that we're under attack, and those words, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. If you have ever been in a combat zone, when an American high-level target says we're under attack, that sets into motion certain security protocols and reactions. Why weren't some of these protocols and reactions followed through? No one can tell me that we did not have the forces that were in place to do certain things to come to the rescue of that ambassador. Maybe he couldn't have gotten there in time for the ambassador, but definitely could have gotten there in time to preclude this enemy from continuing their attack, which lasted for 78 hours. And I found it absolutely astonishing when people will sit there and they will tell you, well, we did not have enough time to get there. Well, that leads me to believe that you're on the presupposition that you knew when the attack would end. And that also is something that causes me a lot of concern. Where are the 33-plus State Department workers that were there? Have not heard from them. The 5 Department of State security agents that defended that consulate, have not heard from them. The 12 to 13 or so CIA agents that were over at the CIA annex, we have not heard from them. Now, I find it very hypocritical that at this moment in time, the American people are being told that they have a moral obligation to go into Syria because of the chemical gas attacks. But yet I never heard the same type of indignation coming from the president nor this administration when our national security interests were attacked. Because an American consulate is sovereign American territory. An American ambassador was killed. Information Management Officer Sean Smith was killed. 2 former Navy SEALs, Ty Woods and Glenn Darty, were killed. Where was our moral indignation, our moral obligation? Where was our response? If there was a time to commit the United States forces to do something, that would have been the time. And I guarantee you, you would have had old retirees like me saying, I'll suit up, I'll go. But why is it that the media, the administration, everyone has really just basically said, as if y'all remember the Star Wars movie, move along, nothing to see here. And you heard the statement that my Fox News colleague made this past Sunday, Juan Williams. There's nothing there. There is something there. And there are questions that have to be answered. Because if we're not careful, history has a way of repeating itself. And if we get involved in Syria, and all of a sudden we're part of the deposing of Bashar al-Assad, which Vladimir Putin is not going to allow to happen anyhow. But if radical Islamic forces take over there, then they have another base of operations, which is exactly what they have in Libya right now. Islamist forces are being trained by al-Ansar, al-Sharia, other al-Qaeda-related forces, Muslim Brotherhood forces, to go and fight in Syria. That's what I mean by the unintended consequences. That's what I mean by not understanding the second and third order effects. That's what I mean by setting into motion a series of uncontrollable events that you have not thought through. The action, the reaction, the counteraction. And that is what has happened in Libya. And we cannot allow it to go away. Because if we allow it to go away, that means it will occur again. I mean, when the president goes in and, asks Hosni Mubarak to step down. And those of us that said, if you have Hosni Mubarak step down, once again, not the greatest of guys, but who do you think is going to step into that, fill that vacuum? It's the Muslim Brotherhood, who's been around since 1928, the grandfather of all terrorist organizations, founded by Hassan al-Banna. And what happened? The Muslim Brotherhood stepped into power. Luckily, the Egyptian military has stood up, and they're doing what is right and responsible in that country. But radical Islamism has now taken root in the Sinai Peninsula to the point where the Israeli resort city of Eilat is now getting rockets and missile fire. 2 weekends ago, a cargo ship was fired upon while transiting through the Suez Canal. Now, can you imagine what would happen if a cargo ship was damaged and sunk in the middle of the Suez Canal to the global economy of the world? You're talking about oil prices shooting out of the sky. That's exactly what will happen. This is why I am concerned about the fact that nobody wants to talk about what happened in Benghazi. And I find it really disgusting and absolutely despicable that Susan Rice was promoted to be the National Security Advisor. And now tomorrow, supposedly, she is going to go up on Capitol Hill to make the case for Syria. Now, this is a person that a year ago went out on 5 Sunday talk shows and basically told a lie to the American people. She got promoted, and now she's got to try to make a case for us to go and get involved in another region in the Middle East. I find it very astonishing that today, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is supposed to receive a medal for her civic engagement and her public service at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. When this is a woman who sat before a committee, and when asked about this and pressed about this, she said, what difference does it make? To those of us who have served in uniform, to those of us who have had to strap it on and be in foreign countries, it makes a huge bit of difference. Why does Benghazi make a huge bit of difference? We abandoned Americans. That does not speak to the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln once said. And if this becomes the new paradigm, if this becomes the new model of leadership in the United States of America, well, I do weep for my country. Because if we start to reward and promote liars, and I don't care, I know this is going to get out there, I mean it. If we start to reward and promote people that will go to bed and go to a fundraiser the next day while Americans are being killed, that says something about who we are as a people. Our moral obligation is to protect and defend Americans and American interests. We failed in our moral obligation in Benghazi. And if we, the American people, do not continue to talk about that, then shame on us. And when you talk about the next generation, when you talk about the country that we will pass on to our children and grandchildren, it will be less of a country than what was given to us by our parents and grandparents. That's the challenge that we face. And that's why we must forevermore remember the Benghazi 4 until we get the truth. Now, on September the 16th, Roger Aronoff is going to host an event here with the Citizens Commission on Benghazi. I would ask you to come back for that, because it's important that we get to the bottom of what happened. And we do not allow a media or political elite, and when I'm talking about a political elite, I'm not talking about, partisanship. Because I would like Speaker Boehner to explain to us why he will not allow a select committee on Benghazi to be appointed. It's been a year. 5 different House committees have not gotten anywhere near the truth on this. And I ask you to ask the Speaker why he will not support a select committee on this. Ladies and gentlemen, we can do better. We have to do better. So tomorrow, not only do we remember the Americans that were killed in 2001, we will also be remembering the Americans who were abandoned in 2012. God bless you all, and what are your questions?
We have time for a few questions, and we have a couple of roving microphones. So those who do have a question for the Congressman, please raise your hand. Identify yourself by name and affiliation so that our viewers on the internet can know who is speaking, please.
Milton Grenfell, American citizen. Just curious, there seems to be a vast cover-up, for lack of a better word. What is the motivation that is uniting all these people? I mean, is it a large number from all kinds of different affiliations?
Yeah.
What is it that's behind it all?
Well, I will tell you there are 2 theories that are out there. There is one theory that there is a gun-running operation that is occurring in Libya to funnel weapons into Syria. And, of course, those weapons seemingly are being funneled to the Supreme Military Council, the Islamist forces that are there. They're not getting over to the Free Syrian Army. There's another theory out there that this was a kidnapping attempt that went wrong, because if you have been paying attention, there was a lot of chatter coming out of the Morsi government about them wanting the blind sheik back. And there's a possible belief that there was a swap that was going to occur. But for the life of me, there is nothing that I can think of that explains, first and foremost, why was that ambassador sent there on that day? That's where we start. And there are only 2 people that can answer that question: the Secretary of State and the President. Because an ambassador is the direct representative of the President of the United States in a foreign country. So those 2 people have to answer that question. And then we can go from there. Down front here, got a couple.
My name is, can you hear me?
I hear you very well. Even though I'm artillery, I still hear you.
My name is John Smith.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
from the Hilton Head area of South Carolina. A lot has been made in reference to Benghazi to a stand-down order, which seems to me to be an irrelevance. I would like to ask you, for any action to take place overseas, is or is not the president the only individual that can authorize such military action?
Well, you do have the geographic combatant commander. In this case, it was the AFRICOM commander, General Carter Ham. He happened to be in Washington, D.C. at the time. General Carter Ham does have the authority to release forces within his geographical area of responsibility. He probably does, since he responds to three people, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, and the President, to inform them of his decision. Now, if something were to say contrary to whatever decision he would have made, then it would have come from one of those three entities. We had the forces that were there. You know, you have in extremis forces, which were your high-level special operations forces that could have been pushed into that area. You have the Marine fast teams. You also have the forward Department of State security teams that could have been there. So there were, you know, the opportunity to provide some reinforcement there, but for whatever reason, none of that happened. And again, I mean, this is something that we know that this was not about a spontaneous reaction to a video. We know that this was well-aimed mortar fire that they were using. And you don't, as John McCain said, you don't take a mortar tube and RPGs to a spontaneous demonstration. But the thing that you really have to understand is that those two former Navy SEALs were lasing targets. They were lasing those mortar tubes. I mean, we know that as a fact. And so basically the belief was that they thought that there was going to be close air support that would come in to assist them in that operation. And so again, you know, who did not release the F-16s that could have come out of Aviano, you know, done either an in-fuel area refueling, or could have stopped off at Sigonella and done a hot refuel and been right down there in time. And as Lieutenant General McInerney has stated, you always keep people on strip alert there in Aviano. So we had those assets. And then we go back to the lady back there in the green shawl.
Hi, Joe Lukic, and
Yes,
I'm retired military, but also a small
Thank you for your service,
businessman that does work in Turkey and the Middle East. And I find it very interesting that, you know, Congressman Boehner, Speaker Boehner, doesn't wish to pursue the obvious. Having been formerly, in my earlier life, a member of a weapons buyback team, which is exactly what those guys were doing in the annex, and having witnessed and seen the day following the supper between our dead ambassador and the Turkish consul general, the very night that the ambassador ended up being killed, it really makes one wonder whether the cover-up, and there's no question in my military mind that it is a cover-up, was intended to gloss over and camouflage the fact that there was in fact a weapons buyback program going on, and that the ambassador lost his life because of Hillary Clinton's announced light footprint, which meant these guys put their lives on the line to be guarded by militia members.
Yes.
I mean, I can't understand why the participants have not, you know, I know about the non-disclosure agreements and the pressure being brought to bear on these poor guys, and the wounded guy who apparently is recovering in Walter Reed.
Yeah.
But, I mean, what is it we can do, we as citizens, to try and pressure Boehner to blow the cover off of this thing?
Well, first of all, I will tell you that Fred Burton and Samuel Katz have just recently written a book, came out this last week, called Under Fire, The Untold Story of Benghazi, and basically it's the account from those 5 Department of State security agents, so please go out and purchase that book. But I think that you've got to make the phone calls. You've got to really emails and things of that nature to Speaker Boehner, because we have got to get to the bottom of this, because 5 different committees, 5 different jurisdictions, they have not been able to do so, and they've gone at it in various different ways. You need to have, in the military, we have unity of command, unity of effort. You need one committee with subpoena powers that can really go after this thing and get to the bottom of it, and we haven't gotten there yet. And you're right, when you think about the fact that, Ambassador Chris Stevens was meeting with a representative from the Turkish government. Well, who is one of the biggest, suppliers and supporters of the rebel forces in Syria? The Turkish government. And when you look at Prime Minister Erdogan, I mean, he is really an Islamist. He's a smart Islamist. Morsi was a dumb Islamist. I mean, he moved pretty fast and he showed his hands. But you look at some of the things that are happening in Turkey, and recently they had protests to say they don't want to see Turkey go the way of an Islamic Sharia-dominated country. They want it to be, as Kemal Ataturk wanted, a secular Islamic country. So there are big concerns about the relationship under the table that we have between this administration and Turkey. And remember, one of the first countries that the president went and spoke to was Turkey in their General Assembly. He's called Prime Minister Erdogan one of his best friends. So this is very concerning, and I think this is where we have to get to the bottom of this and, like you say, blow the cover off of what is going on. 400 shoulder-fire surface-to-air missiles somehow came up missing. The last thing Prime Minister Netanyahu wants is one of those surface-to-air missiles to be somewhere near Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. That's a possibility. And, if you looked at Bashar al-Assad when he talked about, there will be retribution, it does not have to come from him. It can come from Hezbollah. It can come from Hamas. It can come from various other, groups. And because of the fact that we have such an open border here in the United States of America, not everyone is coming into this country to mow our grass, fix our roofs, or babysit our children. Okay? Hezbollah is working with Mexican drug cartels. Al-Quds, the Iranian Al-Quds Brigade, has forces down in Latin America. So the proliferation of these missiles is something that we should be very concerned about. And again, this is what we have, the unintended consequences, second and third, fourth order effects. That's why we have to have a serious talk, a serious committee that digs into Benghazi and bring back people like former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Bring back Susan Rice. How many people ask themselves, why did Susan Rice come out on Sunday? Susan Rice had no business coming out on Sunday talking about this. The only 2 people that should have talked about this was Secretary of State or maybe Secretary of Defense. So why did the loyal acolyte come out and spread the falsehoods that she did? That's another question that has to be answered. Who told her to go out and do that? Victoria Nuland, who recently got promoted. She's another one that needs to be brought before a select committee and asked the hard questions. The 4 people that they put on paid administrative leave who now they've given their job back, those were just, temporary scapegoats. This goes a lot higher. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, Karina Rollins at the Heritage Foundation.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for speaking the truth here. And
Truth is easy. That's
and
what my mom
always.
told me.
These days, though, it takes a lot of courage, unfortunately, and you're one of the few
I don't take
who
courage.
doesn't.
You know what? Stop saying that. Because when you say that, you give people an out. Okay? It should not take courage to speak the truth.
It shouldn't, but it does.
Well, shame on them.
I agree. Shame on them.
Absolutely.
My question is, I just want to make sure that I understood something correctly. When you said that, one of the excuses being given by the administration was that, we couldn't get there in time.
Mm-hmm.
You said something just now during your remarks about that implied that they would know when the attack would be over.
Yeah.
Are you insinuating something more sinister than just cowardly appeasement and utter incompetence?
All I'm saying is that I don't accept the excuse that we couldn't get there in time. That would be just the same as when I was 10 years ago when I was a battalion commander in Iraq, and one of my patrols or whatever came under attack, and they, instead of sending the QRF, I say, hey, don't worry about it. It'll be over in 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. How would I know that the firefight's going to be over in 30 minutes? Okay, so I don't accept this excuse that we did not have the time. You know, we come to the rescue of our fallen. If you think about what happened in Mogadishu, Somalia, they did not leave a single person behind. They did everything they could afterwards to go back and get the pilot that was captured by the Somali pirates. But they were not going to leave their comrades behind. And you want to talk about courage. You think about those 2 Delta Force snipers that knew they were being dropped down into a hot firefight, and they may not get reinforcements, but that was the right thing to do. So for anyone to stand up and say that, you know, we didn't have enough time to get someone there, that's not who we are. And that's, again, someone needs to be held accountable and responsible for the actions that occurred a year ago in Benghazi. And to this point, no one has. This is very shameful. And this sets a horrible precedent going forward in this country.
Susan Warren from Rockville, Maryland.
Yes, ma'am.
You said there's numerous people that were involved in Benghazi, and nobody's heard from any of them.
Yes,
Several
ma'am.
groups of people. Are they all under a gag order? Are they all hiding somewhere?
Well, some, probably so. Some were told, they had a non-disclosure agreement specifically for this. Now, you may have to sign a non-disclosure agreement because you have access to, top secret material, what have you. But for someone to be told they have a non-disclosure agreement for this certain thing, something's wrong. You should not tell people you cannot talk about what happened there. So there are 30 to 35 State Department workers that were in that consulate that were rescued. And they were evacuated to Ramstein Air Force Base. They were taken to Landstuhl Hospital. Never heard from them. As I said, 5 Department of State security agents. One of them is still at Walter Reed, recovering from his wounds and injuries. The other 4 are back to duty. I don't know where. They're spread out all over the place. The Burton and Katz book talk about them. They are agents A, B, C, D, and E. Their names are never used. And then there are the CIA agents that were at the annex that are gone. Something is amiss here. The American people should not be kept in the dark about this. This is supposed to be the most transparent administration in the history of the country.
I just have one other thing, too. First, I would just like to thank you for your service to our
It's my
country in
honor.
the military and in our government.
Yes, ma'am.
And also, a little off topic, there's a lot going on in Washington tomorrow with the Muslim March, the Million Man Muslim March, and the 2 million bikers, patriots that are coming
Yeah.
into town.
Yeah.
Are you planning on riding with those patriots tomorrow?
I wish I could. My motorcycle is down there in Florida, but interestingly enough, the motorcyclists were not given a permit to have the red light stop so they could, transit through here in about 2 or 3 hours. So be prepared for an incredible traffic jam when you get I'm sure hundreds of thousands of bikers will be coming through here, and they will obey the traffic laws and everything. They're not going to be this Million Americans Against Fear march. There's not going to be a lot of people there. And I'm kind of upset that former chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Emmanuel Cleaver, has agreed to speak at their little rally. So that worries me.
There's another one in about 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much, folks. Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're ready to move on to the next part of our program after this wonderful keynote, wonderful start to the discussion. If you want to stay for a little while, stay for as long as you like. Let's see. Mary, come on in. So, Steve, and do we know if Peter is on the way? Somebody feels can hold him out of his office. Okay. So for the second part of our program, we have a panel of distinguished experts who are here to analyze and reflect on what happened in Benghazi, how it connects to what we're seeing happening today, and the general state of the investigation and the reforms within the government that have taken place or not taken place since 1 year ago. Our first speaker, if she's had time to gather her thoughts after a busy commute over here, is Dr. Mary Haybeck. She's an American scholar of international relations and has held appointments at the National Security Council and served as Associate Professor of History at Yale University. She also coordinated the Yale Russian Archive Project to facilitate access to documents in the former Soviet archives. She holds a PhD in history from Yale and is currently Associate Professor of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University. After her, we'll have as a speaker Dr. Stephen Bucci. In fact, the two next speakers are colleagues of mine here at Heritage. Dr. Bucci served America for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and a top Pentagon official. And he is currently the director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies here at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Bucci's research and writing at Heritage focuses on cybersecurity, special operations, and defense support for civil authorities. He joined the think tank here as a senior research fellow for Defense and Homeland Security in April of 2012 and was promoted in the following December. Our last speaker will be Peter Brooks, our senior fellow for National Security Affairs. He works on developing and communicating the Heritage Foundation's stance on foreign policy and defense policy through his research and writing in numerous media and public appearances and congressional testimony. Any morning you turn on Fox News, you may well be met by Peter's smiling face, where he often comments on Benghazi and other security issues. Peter Brooks served as in the administration of President George W. Bush as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs. In this post, he was responsible for U.S. defense policy for 38 countries and 5 bilateral defense alliances. He also served with the CIA and the State Department at the United Nations. He is a Navy veteran and has flown more miles than Hillary Clinton, and is currently an indispensable part of the Heritage team. So we will get our program underway again. Mary, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to have just 4 quick points that I'd like to make about the Benghazi attacks themselves and what they might tell us about both al-Qaeda and our own policies. Benghazi really did not come out of the blue. With the success of the Libyan revolution, there was a sudden and unexpected uptick in violence in Benghazi and Derna against the international community and the countries like the U.S. and Britain that had helped the Libyan people to overthrow Gaddafi in the first place. Unexpected because, after all, we had just helped them to overthrow this dictator. Why are they attacking us? So from March through August 2012, in Benghazi alone, not even to talk about Derna or other places, there were IED and or RPG attacks on a UN convoy, the U.S. consulate, the one that would later be attacked. In fact, it was attacked twice before then, the ICRC, and the British ambassador. In addition to multiple assaults on a prison holding jihadists, on Sufi shrines, and on the High Court. And they were carried out by groups that at least espoused al-Qaeda's ideology and version of Sharia. The 9/11 assault on the Benghazi consulate by AQIM and other al-Qaeda-linked groups that led to the death of Ambassador Stevens and 3 other Americans came directly from this escalation in violence. Since that attack, the violence in Libya and Benghazi in particular has continued unabated, even though we're not really paying attention to it. 4 Benghazi police stations, a favorite target of al-Qaeda-associated forces, were bombed in just 1 week in May, and that has continued throughout the summer. 50 individuals, most political and security figures, have been assassinated in Benghazi alone. And an assault on the Benghazi prison allowed at least 1,000 prisoners to escape this summer as well. In the days after that jailbreak, by the way, a series of explosions in the city targeted judicial sites and military and security personnel. And that's just Benghazi. I haven't even mentioned what's been happening in Tripoli, Derna, and elsewhere. So the first point is that entire attack did not come out of the blue. It has a history behind it. Secondly, al-Qaeda's involvement did not come out of the blue. In fact, al-Qaeda's involvement in Libya began within days of the first protests and demonstrations in the country in February of 2011. A group calling itself the Islamic Emirate of Barqa, whose leaders were members of al-Qaeda that had been just released from prison in Libya, stormed a military arsenal in Derna and seized over 250 weapons, killed 4 soldiers, and wounded 16 others. A few days later, the same group attacked the port in Derna and seized 70 military vehicles. As CNN reported in December of 2011, Zawahiri took full advantage of the chaotic conditions in the country to personally send experienced jihadists to Libya in May of 2011 and soon had mobilized, at least according to their reporting, at least 200 fighters for the group. Participation in overthrowing Gaddafi was just part of al-Qaeda's efforts in Libya, by the way. Very quickly, groups connected to the organization were deeply involved in political institution building in an attempt to impose al-Qaeda's version of Sharia. In April of 2011, for instance, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb was happy to publicly announce that it had created Islamic Emirates in Derna, Benghazi, El Baida, El Marj, and Shahat. A few months later, a large demonstration in Derna by people waving the al-Qaeda flag called for the imposition of Sharia throughout the entire country. In June of 2012, hundreds of members of Ansar al-Sharia, a group that we now understand is probably linked to al-Qaeda, could stage unopposed a military parade in Benghazi with military vehicles, tanks, mortars, and anti-aircraft guns that demanded the implementation of Sharia. And similar parades were held in other cities. You can go on YouTube and watch one that took place in Sirte, which is Gaddafi's hometown, not long after that. So the second point is al-Qaeda's involvement didn't come out of the blue either. The third point I'd like to make is I think the real question is, why do we keep missing attacks like Benghazi? Why do we keep not paying attention to them? And here I'm not referring to especially assaults on embassies or consulates, but even attacks in the United States that we seem to be missing somehow. So let me give you the rundown of the ones that we've missed since 2009. Abdul Hakim Mujahid Muhammad, hardly a household name, was the man who claimed to be a member of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula who carried out an attack on an Arkansas military recruiting place and killed a couple people back in 2009. Abdul Muttalib was the man who was trained by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and attempted to blow up that airplane over Detroit. Faisal Shahzad was somebody who was trained by the Pakistani Taliban and attempted to carry out that attack on Times Square in 2010. Then we have Benghazi. And I might even add in here Major Hassan's attack on Fort Hood. So why do we keep missing these attacks is my third point. It's not just Benghazi. There, in fact, have been other attacks that I think follow a similar pattern. And the pattern is this. Our conceptualization of the enemy is wrong. We imagine that there's a core in South Asia, degraded, nearly strategically defeated. That is, a terrorist group which desires first and foremost to attack the U.S. It talks about other goals, such as creating some sort of global state, but we imagine that these are mere fantasies and delusional. We also imagine that the so-called affiliates, those groups that are allied somehow or other with al-Qaeda, are actually local groups that have local agendas and that really are not interested in attacking the United States. They're insurgencies. They want to overthrow their local leaders, right? Why should they have anything to do with us? We imagine that the core has little command and control over these affiliates. It suggests things, it tries to get them to do stuff maybe through their public statements and so on, but the affiliates really do as they please, right? And we imagine that recent arguments within these affiliates have weakened them even further. There's, in fact, 3 big arguments going on within these affiliates that are trumpeted by a lot of folks, both within this administration and the expert community, as having tremendously weakened them. They show that these groups are collapsing in any case, and therefore will soon not even be a threat to our partners out there. But we imagine wrong. These views do not explain why groups claiming some sort of affiliation with al-Qaeda and its ideology have spread and multiplied throughout the greater Middle East. Why the very same strategy is being used in places as diverse as Nigeria, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan. Why the violence associated with al-Qaeda is growing rather than shrinking. And why, in this case, especially coming back to Benghazi, we're suddenly attacked by so-called local affiliates. And that is what binds all of them together, all of those attacks. We imagine that these are local groups that are only interested in Yemen, that are only interested in Libya, that are only interested in Pakistan. And we miss the fact that, in fact, they might be interested in attacking us and our interests as well. But even during the 1990s, we shouldn't have missed this. Al-Qaeda aspired to political goals and trained thousands for insurgencies and guerrilla wars rather than terrorism, all over the Muslim-majority world. It's these political goals, by the way, that define al-Qaeda today, and it has become what it has always dreamed of, a global insurgency that at least aspires to have one leadership, that does have one ideology, that does have one jihadist methodology, one extremist version of Sharia, and one distinctive set of objectives, means, and ways, that is, a distinctive unified strategy. By the way, this view not only helps us to understand what's going on with attacks on us, but it also gives us a very different perspective of al-Qaeda as a whole. It would see the core and the affiliates as the same thing, just al-Qaeda. One is just at least an aspiring leadership, and the other the forces in the field that it's attempting to get to follow the orders of its commanders. Understanding the enemy this way gives us a clearer view of the situation in the greater Middle East and in the Muslim-majority world. It explains much of the violence from Indonesia to Morocco and Nigeria to the Caucasus, and helps us to predict who might decide to carry out an attack on us and our allies as well. Thank you.
I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. I appreciate having Congressman West here because he hits on lots of my points ahead of time because our background is so similar. Look, Benghazi was frankly all about the narrative. It is a classic example of American use of a narrative in politics actually driving the decisions by leaders, and in this particular case, driving it in some really, really bad directions. You know, keep in mind, in the middle, when Benghazi occurred, we were having an election. And the president's biggest weak point at that time was his record in foreign policy. He tried to make a big deal over having gotten Osama bin Laden. They considered Libya was a great victory, at least in the way they analyzed it. They were really trying to build on the president's credentials as to be a foreign policy success. That's the line they were selling. It included that Al-Qaeda was defeated, which plays into what Mary was just referring to, that Al-Qaeda core was defeated. These other affiliates, they were sort of lesser players. It wasn't that big a deal. The tides of war are receding. Everybody should just, drop that part of the whole argument and understand that President Obama was the one who did it. Well, maintaining the narrative drove pretty much everything that happened around Benghazi. It drove the decisions, I believe, to not answer Ambassador Stevens' call for more security. Because if you threw more security, if you recognized the danger there in Benghazi, you were accepting the fact that, one, the Libyan thing wasn't working out quite as well, at least not as fast as they thought it would, and if you recognize that the threat was from an al-Qaeda organization, it kind of throws cold water on your argument that al-Qaeda is defeated. Then, once the thing occurred, if we had done a bigger response, if we had moved forces there, if we had done a rescue of the sense that one would have hoped in the midst of that sort of situation, it would have shown big spotlight on this massive failure. And then obviously in the post-attack period where they tried to maintain that ridiculous story that this was all just because people were upset about a video for so long when it was so obvious. I mean, the head guy in Libya had announced it was a terrorist attack. And our leaders are still going, it's just a video, and Hillary Clinton patting the shoulder of the parents who had lost sons there in Benghazi, saying, "Oh no, we're going to get that guy who made that video." This was several days later, not in the first hours. Trust me, the military, we have a saying, the first report's always wrong. So I get some confusion in the first couple hours, but boy, shortly after that, they knew the story, but they were not going to deviate from the narrative, and that drove them to do these stupid things. Now, Hella asked me to just mention a couple of things because I don't have to go through the whole line since Congressman West already did. What did Al Qaeda learn from this event as far as the United States? Well, I think they learned that America was not going to respond very forcefully in these kind of situations. That if they could pull off one of these attacks, remember they've had several others that hadn't worked out for them. We managed to catch them, sometimes by luck, sometimes by good intel work. We managed to stop them, but this one was successful, wildly successful for that group, and we didn't do anything about it. We're still apparently interviewing people. This kind of terrorist attack is not a crime in the sense that a mugging on the street is a crime. It's a terrorist attack. We are still at war. The president can declare that the war is over, but nobody bothered to query the guys on the other side, and they're still fighting. So Al Qaeda learned that they could keep doing this stuff, and there isn't much that this administration is going to do about it. What have we learned overall from the hearings that occurred? There were several congressmen and senators that made a good faith effort to try and chase down the truth. They've had hearings. They took a lot of grief for it. They were accused of chasing false scandals. Well, we learned that, frankly, the Department of State investigation that was conducted was probably inadequate, since it didn't even talk to several eyewitnesses of the events. That's a somewhat egregious mistake, I would think, from an investigatory standpoint. And I'll be honest with you, I thought that part of the investigation would show something. I thought they would actually, try and fix some of the problems that occurred there in state, but they really didn't. I think we've learned that we have not gotten a full accounting of this. We don't have the answers that we as the American public deserve and should have. And I think we've learned that if an administration will stand tightly enough together and be willing to push their version of the truth over what other people might be the truth, that they can actually get away with it, because it appears thus far they have. Maybe not yet. I hope we'll continue to push and get that. And then the last thing is what do we do about diplomatic security? As the American people, we sit there and we know these folks are our reps out in the world. Why are they not more secure? Well, I've been an attaché in an embassy twice and lived overseas a couple other times besides that. And I have to tell you, a diplomatic posting is inherently risky and inherently dangerous. You can't put our people inside fortresses out there because their job is to interact with the local people. They're our country's representatives to that host nation. And that requires interaction. And there's a very difficult balance that must be struck of protecting those folks and allowing them the freedom to do their jobs and have that face-to-face interaction. The way you fine-tune that balance, though, is by listening to the people on the ground. You get stuff from the big intel community in the sky. They feed it out there to the folks. But the people who are living in the country kind of know what's going on, or should. And when they request help, somebody ought to respond or have a darn good reason for not doing it. Like we have more information you don't have, and here it is. This is why you're not getting what you're asking for. Ambassador Chris Stevens was not a political appointee. He wasn't some rookie who, saw an explosion in the street and said, "Oh my gosh, the sky is falling, bring us tanks, bring us everything." That wasn't the kind of guy he was. He was a career Foreign Service professional, hand-picked to go to what was probably one of the highest priority posts for this administration at that time, because we had just participated in overthrowing the government, putting in a new government. Regardless of what else was going on there, whether it was an arms, deal where they were trying to get stuff to go up to Syria, I don't know. It didn't matter. If the ambassador was in that country or in that city, regardless of what his mission was, so part of his portfolio was another city in his country, and he felt that the situation was unsafe and he had requested support, he should have been given it. And I'll end with this, and it kind of echoes something that Congressman West said, but I just have to. The military ethos of not leaving anybody behind is pretty darn strong in our military. I remember coming back from being overseas, and when the film Saving Private Ryan came out, and if you remember the story, it was, they sent 10 guys off into the countryside to look for one guy. Well, you don't need the backstory as to why they were looking for him. And I had somebody ask me after seeing it, said, "Do you think they would have really done that? Send 10 guys off there to find that one guy?" And I said, "I just came back from a mission." And it was during one of our other dust-ups with Saddam Hussein. This is obviously, prior to 2001, where I was responsible for sending, if one pilot went down, so I was trying to protect you guys from fall out of the sky, and that pilot was in the area that was too dangerous for the Air Force search and rescue guys to go.
It's in the Navy then, right?
Nah, well, they came too. They were part of it. Navy soft, the good part of the Navy. We were going to send in 2 huge special operations helicopters, which cost a lot of money. Real fancy avionics. This is why they were sending us, not the regular Air Force guys, because we could get in there. One of them filled with Navy SEALs, the other one filled with Army Special Forces. A lot of really expensive, highly trained, very scarce resources. We were going to go into this dangerous area to pick up one guy. And we were all perfectly okay with that. That's like, yeah, good mission. Not being cavalier, that's our job. So when General Dempsey, and I know Marty Dempsey, and I think a lot of him, but in this case, it baffles me that his answer, when he said, well, it would have been too late and it was too dangerous. No, if there are Americans there, even if they're all dead already, we're still going to send people in there to get them. That's the military ethos. That's what we do. And for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to say, no, we decided not to send anybody because it's going to be too dangerous. We don't want to put anybody else at risk. I'm sorry. That to me is an unacceptable answer that I can only attribute, because I don't think Marty Dempsey, from when I knew him to when he became the chairman, suddenly became a coward. Well, we won't get into that. I just can't believe that someone of higher authority than him did not make him say that. I just have to. So I'll stop right there. We still have not gotten all the answers we need as the American people, and I don't think we should stop asking for those answers until we get them.
Well said. Over to you, Peter.
Well, those are tough acts to follow, being the last batting cleanup here after all of those presentations. And when you do these sort of things, you don't know exactly what order you're going to be in, but you're always worried you're going to be last. And everything has been said, but not everybody said it. So I took a different approach, and I think I may say something a little bit different than the excellent presentations we've already heard. And I was thinking about this. I see how Benghazi might relate to the big issue of the day, which is Syria. And you go, gosh, how is that? But I think the actual or proposed involvement in these two conflicts are related in a way. I believe that a lot of people are skeptical about Syria, right? And I believe that a lot of the reason that people are so skeptical, American people, are so skeptical about Syria, about these targeted, limited, consequential, I think that's the latest words used this morning by John Kerry in House testimony, is because of the Libya intervention. Now, most people, when they talk about Syria, they may mention Iraq, right, because of the WMD connection. We were looking for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We didn't find them. Well, that's not really a good, that's not a good relationship or a good way to connect them, because the fact is that we know there are weapons of mass destruction in Syria. I mean, probably from their use against these people, this terrible use against their people. So it's not exactly the same, but they're related in a different way, in my view. I think like I said, we're skeptical of military involvement in Syria because of how the Obama administration handled Libya, especially in the aftermath of the conflict there. What I'm getting at is, Libya started out as humanitarian intervention, right? I mean, they were worried about that the rebels in Benghazi were going to be crushed by the Libyan army, and that we needed to prevent this terrible possible humanitarian slaughter that might take place in Benghazi. Now, Syria's not exactly the same, but it certainly has a humanitarian aspect, right? I mean, these people were gassed, it appears, and died a terrible death. Plus, there's the punitive nature of this and the deterrence nature about the weapons of mass destruction, about the use against its own people, about future use of that. And, of course, while not intended, the NATO military intervention in Libya ended up in regime change. Not that anybody was sorry to see Gaddafi go. I mean, he had American and other blood certainly on his hands. But the regime change in Libya and the lack of follow-up by the Obama administration that led to the lawlessness, the rise of Islamist and terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. This led, in my opinion, to the attack on our diplomatic facilities in Benghazi on another tragic September 11th. Not only did our facilities come under attack with the tragic death of 4 Americans, but Al-Qaeda began to run amok in North Africa, where they seized a large swath of territory in places like Mali. I think it was about half the size of Texas before the French intervened there. And I'm not sure that people are confident whether the Obama administration has plans beyond punitive strikes in Syria, just like in Libya. We intervened in Libya. The regime was overthrown. The humanitarian disaster was averted, and that was it. It was over. It was done. And I think the same thing people are worried about in Syria. I mean, I personally believe, separating the two, that we have no plan for Syria. There is no comprehensive policy for Syria. And the administration, even with the president tonight, the president's actually going to come out and talk about, we don't need to strike right now because we're going to go to the UN and we're going to try to get a diplomatic solution to this by the one that the Russians proposed. I mean, that's what the news is saying, and that's probably what he's going to say tonight. But the fact is I don't think people really, they never told us what next. After a strike in Syria, then what? And I think we had the same thing, but we realized it. We felt it in Libya. Like I said, the lack of a plan for Libya after intervention had a role in the attack of September 11th last year. It's no wonder, in my view, that people are cynical and reluctant about U.S. involvement in Syria. And I think there is no confidence in this administration's ability to manage Syria. Of course, we have plenty of proof over the last 2.5 years in the death of 100,000 people that they really don't have a plan. I don't believe there's any confidence in people. People have no confidence in the ability of this administration to handle another military intervention, no matter at what level in Syria. So from Iran to Russia to the Arab Spring, I think there's no confidence in the administration's abilities in terms of foreign policy and national security. The problem is that whether we're talking about the tragedy in Libya, which has been talked about this morning, or the question of Syria, both are symptomatic of the increasingly dangerous world we live in and our failing foreign and national security policy under the Obama administration. Libya was marked by a failure to follow up on the intervention, both on the security of our personnel, the rise of al-Qaeda elements, which is not on the run or decimated, no matter what anybody says, as best I can tell, but also the failure to bring those responsible to justice for that attack after a year, despite many promises to do so. It's even more troubling that the White House has seen congressional inquiries into Benghazi as a phony scandal. Remember this from a month or two ago when supposedly somebody had said that these congressional inquiries were a phony scandal along with the IRS and other things? I mean, the real scandal here is that no one has been called to account for those attacks. From what I can tell, those who probably were behind it, either the planning or the operation of it, are still walking the streets of Benghazi. And we have a pretty good idea who they are. If you want to go to FBI.gov, the FBI website, you can see pictures of them. And from what I also can tell, it seems like reporters from the New York Times and CNN have spent more time with these individuals than the U.S. government has. So, I mean, that's the real scandal here. 4 Americans died, others were injured, American sovereign territory was attacked, and nobody has been held accountable for that. For its part, Syria's a failure for not having, as I mentioned, asserted our interests for 2 years while more than 100,000 people died, leaving us in a situation today where there are no good options. Perhaps worse, both cases are emblematic of our diminished influence and stature in the world under the Obama administration, a situation that's only likely to lead to more challenges to our security. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
We'll open it up to questions from our audience. We've now also been joined by another Heritage colleague, Jim Phillips, who does a lot of work on Syria. So, Jim, if you want to pipe up at any point, don't hesitate. We have another question down here in the front.
It's very interesting, but I was stunned to hear someone recommend we should have followed up in Libya or any other place. I mean, our follow-up in Iraq cost us trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of people damaged for life and thousands killed, and no telling how many hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. I'm glad we didn't have a follow-up. But I think the bigger question, I mean, I know this is a focused look, but I do think we should step back every now and then and ask the question, why are we having to contend with these Islamic forces so much? And to me, it's like a hornet's nest. I mean, you can swat a hornet's nest and then keep figuring out, do I get this far away, that far, to hit this hornet, that hornet, how do I hit it? You can worry with all these things, or you can just get away from the hornet's nest. And William Lind and a number of other people, a lot of us are saying, why don't we just back out of all of these internecine battles in the Mideast and let them sort of sort it out? Because the countries where we haven't been involved, in fact, have sorted it out pretty well. And the ones we do get involved, it just goes on and on. We just keep putting fuel into the fire. So I know that's sort of a broader question than we're looking at, but I think it's something that should be thought about as Americans.
I think, Mary, do you want to speak to that? Because you had some theories on why this is not just a coincidence that all this happens.
Yeah, I think about this question a lot because we're so tired of the whole situation, and it doesn't seem like there's a solution. And you're right, it's not just this administration that's having trouble figuring out how to get a solution to it. The Bush administration had trouble. The Clinton administration had trouble. I mean, after all, they tried some cruise missiles, and that didn't figure out the situation. They tried diplomatic pressure. They tried all sorts of things. But if you even go back further than that, Bush, the first, also had trouble. He never figured out Somalia. Even Reagan with Gaddafi the first time around. A few bombing runs did not deal with that situation either, and in fact had some blowback that was quite deadly. Or Beirut, right? So if you take a look from the 1970s to today, which I just did for something else I'm working on, you can see that we've tried it seems, just about every single solution out there. And the problem doesn't get better. It, in fact, has gotten worse and worse over time. So I have some proposals for what to do, but I won't go into those. Instead, I'm going to say why doing nothing is even worse. Because in the places that we're looking at today where things have gotten worse, like Syria, there are no American boots on the ground. And we didn't do anything for a couple of years, as far as I know. And yet the situation got worse and spun out of control without our presence there. In several other instances, we've just allowed the situation to spin out of control, and it doesn't get worse without us. It's not especially our presence that causes the problem. We have to, in fact, give some agency to the enemy. The enemy is doing specific things in order to gain power and to force the situation in their direction. And if we do nothing, it will go only in their direction. What I've said in other fora is, if we do nothing abroad, we might be able to keep ourselves safe, but at the risk of losing the entire greater Middle East to these guys.
I think Mary makes my point regarding, because I think you're referring to me when I said follow-up. I didn't talk about American boots on the ground. I wasn't specific. What I did have in mind, since I had a few moments, was things like counterterrorism operations, law enforcement training, intelligence sharing, because there was a security vacuum. And the Islamists and the terrorists filled that security vacuum. And that led to Benghazi, and others, as Mary had noted. So, I mean, I wasn't talking about on the scale of Iraq. So you made that leap of logic that I wasn't thinking. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. But I think Mary makes the point. My point here is that the fact is that there's a risk in action. There's also a risk in inaction. And if you don't try to shape the events in a certain way, no matter what level of involvement that is, then you're only reacting. And my view is that you need to be proactive in your foreign policy if you're going to protect and advance American interests. And same with any other country. And I think we see what happens, the spillover. We still don't know where thousands of surface-to-air missiles are out of Libya. And I don't know what was going on in the Benghazi diplomatic compounds. I don't know. I don't want to speculate. But the fact is, we also saw what happened in northern Mali. I mean, these groups. We saw the attack on the natural gas plant in Algeria. These all were spawned by what happened in Libya. So the fact is that we kind of, what I would say is we fired and forgot with Libya, led to this, and it could have been worse. I mean, and it affected we always think about how did it affect American interests, but it affected other interests, as Mary talked about. So when I talk about follow-up, that could be something as simple as counterterrorism operations, joint counterterrorism training, law enforcement training, intelligence sharing. But I think, nature abhors a vacuum, especially a security vacuum. And after it was over, what happened was the rise of the lawlessness, the chaos that groups like Al-Qaeda and other militant Islamist groups thrive in.
And just real quickly, it isn't a real good solution just to say, well, we're just going to back away and leave everybody else alone, because they'll actually be better off without us. 9/11, we didn't do anything to provoke them to attack us. They saw it. Yeah, they got mad because we helped Kuwait against Saddam Hussein. So there's a lot of ways that people interpret what we do and see their interests. What we think is there needs to be a lot more nuance. There needs to be a lot more thought that goes into these engagements and how we do them, what we do them with, what level of involvement the United States is going to be involved in. We tend to do things in very broad terms and, frankly, kind of ham-handedly. It's like with medical care. It's always best to figure out what you can do non-invasively before you get into the invasive stuff. And it kind of works that way with international relations as well. And like it is or not, America is a global entity. It's a global power, and we're never going to be able to retreat back behind the oceans again. And I don't think we really want it to, because we do act as a force of good in a lot of situations in the world, not in all of them. But I don't think we're going to go back to that. So.
Mary, did you want to follow up on what Steve was
Well,
saying?
just on the point of 9/11, I can see some skepticism. But if you read the Harmony database documents that were captured in Afghanistan after 9/11, CTC has a really nice database of these documents. There's only a few dozen of them. But they sort of give you an inside look at what Al-Qaeda was up to, their vision of themselves, how they defined themselves, and how they organized themselves for what they saw as a 200-year war. In their vision, attacking America was supposed to make us leave. And then they could get on with the real part 2 of their war. So they argued then and later that the U.S. couldn't stand to have, as they put it, a real Islamic State like the Taliban, and that we would always intervene and stop them from creating a real Islamic State. So until they chased us out of the Middle East and out of every Muslim-majority country, they would be incapable of carrying out their greater political plans that I alluded to. And their greater political plans were to set up this Islamic State. The U.S. is the big interferer in this, they said. So their Islamic State is supposed to include the entire greater Middle East, anywhere that there's a Muslim-majority country or population. So everywhere from Nigeria up through Spain, southern Spain, which, by the way, they claim, through Italy, the Balkans, most of Russia, which they also claim, and a huge chunk of China, through Indonesia, the Philippines, and then just draw a line that includes all of that territory. That's what they claim is theirs, and that's the state that they want to create. As, by the way, a third step, and the final step is, of course, world conquest, where everybody will be forced to acknowledge their version of Sharia. So if you take that as their vision, first attacking America was just the first step in this much bigger plan. The things that they were saying publicly at the time can be seen, I think, as more of what they were, an attempt to incite, arouse, get other people on their side, or to convince the U.S. that if you just withdraw, we'll leave you okay. You'll be fine. It's like the old story about what the alligator ate last, right? You live on a farm, your pond gets an alligator in it, but you don't do anything about it because it's not threatening you, right? It eats all of your farm animals, but then maybe it'll come for you, right? So that's actually the way they view it. We will choose to be the last ones eaten by the alligator by withdrawing.
Okay, well, we've got a lot of questions here. Let's see. Why don't we go to the back here to the lady in the brown.
My name is Laska Lau. I'm from Bethesda, just a heritage supporter. From what I'm understanding you're saying today, or maybe I'm drawing my own conclusions, that the buildup of terrorism and Islamic jihad has been going on for many, many years. Most of the people I talk to say it was all Bush's fault, that he accelerated all of this. So my question to you is, did his interaction in Iraq accelerate or decelerate the rise of Islam or jihad around?
You go first.
I think absolutely, in one way, and later on, no. So the absolutely is the way that the first intervention was carried out, with those sort of false hopes and dreams that it would turn out like Afghanistan had at the time. If you remember, Afghanistan went so swimmingly, and we really believed that all you had to do was topple the regime, and everybody would love us and welcome us, and forget all about the way we betrayed the Shia, 10 years before then. And everything would go just fine for us, as it was in Afghanistan. And because of that, we weren't expecting, planned for, prepared for a long-term insurgency. And then once the insurgency started, we had a plan that was guaranteed to cause the insurgency to spin out of control until 2007, when we actually came up with the right idea and the right way of dealing with it. And for 2 years, we fought a very successful counterinsurgency and suppressed the violence from, I think there were over 20,000 people being killed a year in the violence, down to several hundred people being killed by these guys. So down to really a terrorism threat rather than an insurgency. But it takes about 8 years to train a military from zero to something that can actually deal with the situation on the ground. And this president chose to withdraw after only 4 years of training. And it left behind a military that was completely unready for the level of violence that has slowly started to build itself. And by the way, also made it impossible for us to have the boots on the ground necessary to deal with the situation right next door in Syria that was spinning out of control. Think how very different the situation would be today if we had left those trainers even on the ground to be working with these guys. So, yes, it did. But we have no boots on the ground in Syria, and there is a far worse radicalization problem going on there. We have no boots on the ground in Libya, and there's a far worse radicalization situation going on there. So, yes, but.
And again, we tend to have a very American-centric view of the world, and we think everything, on one hand, we'll usually say everything good is, comes from us, but we also have this wonderful tendency to think everything that's bad out there is because of something we did or something we said. As Mary pointed out, these jihadists, they had a plan already, and it wasn't something just to counter us. It's a plan. We're part of it because we're a player on the field, but their plan would have been there even if America had suddenly disappeared in a big puff of smoke. They just wouldn't have had to worry about us anymore. So I think it's probably a stretch to say we provoked all of this. There were some unintended consequences. I think our actions, post 9/11 probably gave rise to some of these affiliate groups being as capable as they are, mostly because we beat up the core so well and had been doing that for quite a few years. I don't think we envisioned, I know we didn't at the Pentagon, the kind of growth of the al-Qaeda affiliates that are out there now today. We didn't see that coming, not to the degree that it's happened and how capable those guys are getting. And that's an unfortunate development, but your option was not doing anything to them. And I don't think after 9/11 that was really an option for us.
Yes, question down here in the front.
This one. He can wait. I know.
Thank you. Well, move it back.
I'd like someone, somewhere, to do a cost-benefit analysis of the latest proposals on Syria. Having worked in southeastern Turkey right now, I will tell you there is one whale of a lot of suffering, humanitarian suffering, going on inside those refugee camps. Having been to Amman, Jordan, and Jordan working with the Jordanian Armed Forces, you guys know how many boots on the ground it's going to take to locate, secure, and then remove those chemical munitions. I mean, where are the 75,000 plus boots going to come from? I mean, the French historically have had an interest in that region, Hatay province of southeastern Turkey. Maybe the Saudis, maybe what kind of a coalition is it going to take, Peter, to go in there? I mean, it cost us billions to destroy our own chemical stockpiles on Johnson Island Atoll. Billions to get rid of our own chemical weapons. You can hear Obama right now in your mind. It's going to be humanitarian. We're going to help these poor, suffering refugee people. But if JCS has got their act together, they're going to say, hey, Mr. President, keep your mouth shut about destroying chemical weapons. Comments?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your comments. I don't think we're there yet, first of all. I think the president is getting back into his sweet spot because he wanted to be at the UN in the first place.
Right.
But there's so many issues here. I mean, there's reasons for people to be skeptical about, will Syria play along? Is Assad betting that he can beat the rebels with Iran and Hezbollah's help before he has to turn these weapons over? Does he really need these weapons? Is he gonna hang out some military commanders to dry as those responsible for it, saying it wasn't a national policy? the president probably won't need to ask. I think he's going to try to get congressional support for a strike just to keep the pressure on him. And I think they're going to claim credit for saying that all of these threats that we've made Assad move in this direction. So, I mean, relations with Russia, there's so many things here. So I don't think we're there. We're talking about, Steve has said, I think, 75,000 troops to secure these weapons. Maybe that was non-permissive, but still, it's going to take a lot of people if you're going to do it. So do you get a UN peacekeeping force? What's the intelligence? There's so many things. Will the Syrians sign a chemical weapons convention? And of course, once they sign a chemical weapons convention, even if they turn over these chemical weapons, all you need is a chemical industry to produce these weapons again. So then it goes underground. You know what I mean? So there's so many issues here, and that's why I'm saying there's no comprehensive policy for Syria. So while I agree with you, there's so many questions, and there's dollar figures, whether you're talking about cruise missiles through windows of the Ministry of Defense, or boots on the ground, or whatever. Syria is a mess. We have no policy. It's not going to get any better. And then, of course, they were worried about shifting the balance of power on the battlefield, because if you take out command and control, it's going to affect other things other than chemical weapons. What do you get after that if the rebels win? We've had years to develop a force, to help develop a force and arm a force that we could support here, and we've done nothing. And I think, as Mary talks about, sometimes doing nothing makes things worse. And even with the chemical weapons, we're treating the disease symptomatically. We're not treating the disease. The belief that Assad was a reformer, which major people at senior levels in this administration have talked about, how he's I just go back to remembering the rat lines that went out of Syria into Iraq. Syria is the second most active state sponsor of terrorism in the world after Iran. It's an ally of Iran. It had a nuclear program supported by the North Koreans before the Israelis took it out in 2007. My point here about all this rambling is that it's a mess. Yeah. And it doesn't support American interests, and we've done little about it. And now when 1,400 people have tragically died at the hands of chemical weapons, when 100,000 people died before that, now we're going to do something about it. So there's still a lot to be done besides the chemical weapons, which I'm not sure is really going to, I don't know how much traction that's going to get and how long it's going to take. But it doesn't change things on the battlefield and the human suffering that you're talking about, whether you're talking about the refugee camps in Jordan or Turkey or inside the country itself.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this didn't start with a Russian plan. This started with our Secretary of State giving a sort of a wise guy answer to a press question, being a smarty pants, and was being very sarcastic. And now the Russians have jumped on it. The administration suddenly see it as a lifeline to get out of this conundrum of they're about to get a no vote from Congress, with Senate one way or the other, the House probably definitely a no, and suddenly they have a diplomatic solution. Which always sounds good, but as Peter alluded to, and so did you, this diplomatic solution is going to cost a fortune. There's still a civil war going on. So even if they said, okay, come on in, secure our weapons, there's bad guys on the ground shooting at people. And I testified before Congress, 75,000 people, regardless of who they are, coming into your country is called an invasion. People have suggested the Turks, they've got a big army. The Syrians didn't like it the last time the Turks came into their country. There's still a lot of bad feelings about that time period. The Jordanians don't have enough. They've got some sophisticated forces that we've been working with in training, but they're pretty small military and they don't have much money at all. We darn sure don't want the Russians doing it. They are not our best friends, which is another thing that Putin threw this line to the president. The president owes Mr. Putin a favor now. Yeah. And that's not necessarily something you really want to have there. So it's just this morning we talked about this over in the Senate in one of the caucuses, and you could see all the staffers going, yeah, we hadn't thought about that. And I always point out there's a Captain Bucci out there who's in the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, and while it's unlikely the United States would provide the 75,000, very unlikely, my guess is we will send some technical people, stuff like that. I'm not real thrilled about Captain Bucci showing up there in Damascus trying to take care of this stuff when there's a civil war going on. So this is not like let's all do high fives. We've come up with a diplomatic solution on this.
Okay. Right there.
Behave, Chuck.
I know Dr. Bucci is he's a student of von Clausewitz, and von Clausewitz said that war is the last act of diplomacy. I'm wondering if we can just let's talk about 2020 going forward. Let's look forward down the road. Do you think our administrations in the last since about 2011 have had a tendency to be short on diplomacy and quicker to go to that last act? Or should we maybe beef up our diplomatic efforts worldwide?
I think this is something we've looked at. You know, one of the things we learned from Iraq and Afghanistan was that, you know, it's the Colin Powell's thing. If you break it, you buy it. And that buy-in part of fixing countries is really not the military's forte. And they can do it, like they can do almost anything they're asked to do, but they usually do it very expensively, and if it's not their specialty, not as well as you would like. We do not in this country have a capability to surge diplomatic forces, the kind of organizations you need to rebuild nations, and we need to do a better job of that. The military is actually making a big effort to move towards that kind of engagement, specifically U.S. SOCOM, the Special Operations guys, are trying to do that. They should not be doing that alone. They need to be doing that with the Department of State, with USAID, with all the other diplomatic entities that we have out there. And it's kind of weak right now. And one of the problems you have, and everybody always beats up Republicans for wanting to go to war, the problem is administration like this one, they like to do this war light, which is still war. And as I point out to people, you know, our precision munitions, precision in the military vernacular is not like laser surgery on your knee. It makes big holes in the ground the size of buildings and kills everybody that were around that hole. So, you know, while, you know, if we do have to do these missile strikes, which we think are just a stupid idea because they're really not going to help the situation and could make it worse, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. And, you know, while, yeah, we can hit this water bottle, but everybody else in the room here is in deep trouble besides that water bottle. And so there's going to be a lot of people on the news, you know, getting video of all the damage that we do if we make these strikes. So.
I think also when you talk about diplomacy, and obviously, of course, there's economic sanctions, there's informational. I mean, there's all sorts of instruments of national policy. Critically important to have the credible threat to back them up. You want to talk about Clausewitz, you can talk about Frederick the Great, right? What do you say? You know, diplomacy is music without instruments. So, I mean, it's critically important to be able to, you know, have a credible threat of force behind it. But the other thing it also comes down to is your diplomacy, I think, is based on perceptions of your strength and influence. And my concern is that the United States' influence is perceived. We're perceived to be in decline by many countries and many groups, which I think makes us vulnerable, and people are willing to test us. And that's why I think the Obama administration is worried about Syria, because they're really thinking about Iran, right? They're thinking about North Korea. Deterrence is in the mind of the deterred. So, you know, you can deter people diplomatically, and I think the Obama administration may try to take credit for this, but they used force to do that. They're going to say, well, we're back to the diplomatic option, or potential diplomatic options, because we threatened force. So I mean, obviously they're symbiotic in many ways. And I mean, sometimes, like Afghanistan, I don't think we had a choice in that one in terms of responding with force. Iraq, perhaps you can, depending on the way you look at it, you could decide that. Libya was certainly a choice by a different sort of administration. I mean, it was humanitarian. So, you know, not only were they, I mean, I would say if you were looking at Libya, you were saying that's more of a moral, ethical choice than it was a national interest choice. I mean, what was the national interest? I mean, obviously, other than being Americans and being human beings and the importance of that and human life in general. But that really came down on the moral or ethical side, because they were worried about something. I think people on the Democratic administrations were haunted by things like Bosnia, by Rwanda. And so they felt they had to do something there, and that's a moral or ethical choice more than perhaps a national interest choice. And then of course you have to make these sort of choices. But and then of course once again, I mean, the United Nations is the epicenter of international diplomacy, and how effective has that been on security issues? I mean, I think the United Nations has its place in certain ways. I think they do a great job handing out food. giving kids shots. But their real purpose in the aftermath of the bloodiness of World War II, I don't think in many cases has been realized. That is to act against threats to peace and security. And on security, look at Syria. I mean, nothing. I'm talking about the chemical weapons. I'm talking about Syria in general. Look about it on the United Nations. You know, we've been negotiating with outside of the UN with Iran on their nuclear program for anybody know? A decade. 2003 negotiations started with Iran. We've made no progress. So, I mean, it's obviously a mix of those sort of things, but a lot of it comes down to is, you know, the perceptions of your strength and international influence that can make the diplomacy more effective, not only your ability to undertake military operations.
I'd agree, especially when one is dealing with bad actors, that if you're not negotiating from a position of strength, then you find yourself in trouble. But this administration is actually having trouble with our allies diplomatically. And I think that shows that there has been a systemic failure. And it's not, in my opinion, it doesn't have anything to do with the State Department or who's in charge of the State Department, because that level of failure actually comes from the top. And it's the responsibility of the president to manage relationships with his peers. And what I think we've seen throughout the last 5 years is a failure to build relationships, strong relationships, and to manage relationships. And that's a constant thing. That takes weekly interactions. It is time intensive, and he's refused to have conversations with a lot of people, even conversations, let alone the intensive interaction that's necessary to create and build real relationships. And unfortunately, a lot of that failure is now coming home to roost on us in the form of a lack of allies to support us in this endeavor.
Okay, another question in the back here.
I just wanted to say thanks to Dr. Howick. You wrote a book, Knowing the Enemy, which was an amazing book. But we're talking about Libya and, you know, the rise of, I guess, what we're calling ultra-Orthodox Salafism or whatever. Is there a real groundswell in these, you know, these post-Arab Spring countries or people that are dealing with it right now? And is there a relationship between the militias and the new political parties that we've seen in all 4 of the states, it seems like, that have emerged from revolutions?
So I wouldn't be certain of that, because I haven't seen any good data, and I haven't seen folks on the ground doing the sort of, you know, interviewing or work that would show us what's actually happening amongst the broader population. But since what we're dealing with here is people attempting to create an insurgency, what we really need to ask ourselves is how much success have the insurgents had in spreading their vision and their concepts, whether the people on the ground support it or not. One of the things that is, I think, very poorly understood outside of a small circle of people who study irregular warfare is that you only need 2 to 5% of the population on your side and working with you in order to have a self-sustaining insurgency. You don't have to have 51%. And the vast majority of people in insurgencies and irregular warfare are sort of indifferent. They don't support the government, they don't support the insurgents, and it's whoever is making the effort to win them over that actually comes out on top. So what I would urge you to look at, and it's not something I've looked at myself yet, although it's something I'm going to be doing in the next few months for my next book, which is, by the way, on Al-Qaeda's grand strategy, is looking at where they are managing to spread their version of Sharia, which is a very, 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 very specific version of Sharia, and is a signature of their influence. Wherever they're forcing people, and it's always forcing people to follow their version of Sharia, they can make, I think, a serious claim to having control on the ground, right? So rather than looking at a polling data, you would need to look at something like that to see data that shows that kind of metric in order to see how successful they're being.
Okay, Jim Phillips.
He can't ask questions.
This could be hard.
Well, it
Ask
seems
Brother
to,
Bucci.
well, I take Steve's point about the narrative, you know, an election year. Yeah, I don't want to write that off, but it's even gone beyond that in terms of how the administration thinks about terrorism in general. And one of the things that seems to me is that the administration has gone back to the future in a sense and applying this law enforcement approach to terrorism, which I think is one of the reasons why we haven't seen any progress made in Libya, is that you need a governing partner to arrest and bring these people to justice if you just see them in terms of criminals. But in Libya, we don't have that government. And given the fact that there's been very little progress made on this investigation, how do you think the U.S. government, this would be to everybody on the panel, could increase deterrence against another attack on an embassy in Libya or elsewhere by adopting a different paradigm rather than just a strict law enforcement approach that really handcuffs us to existing governments that maybe aren't there in a big chunk of the Middle East?
Well, I'm not a big proponent of the law enforcement paradigm. I think it's what got us to 9/11. The Clinton administration treated it that way, and they occasionally did the therapeutic strikes with cruise missiles, and it didn't do anything, and in fact emboldened al-Qaeda to do what they did. Now, be totally truthful, and we tried it the other way with the Bush administration, where we tried to hunt these guys down and catch them or kill them, and we ended up having this metastasizing of groups around the world. So there's a downside to that one too. Normally when you have two different things and neither one of them works, maybe you find the space in the middle, and maybe that'll work better. I don't know, Jim. I think in today's world, as radicalized as some of these groups are, I think the law enforcement one just has no possibility of being helpful, even in the countries where we do have a good law enforcement partner we can work with. And there's several of these countries where these folks gravitate to, as you mentioned, that we don't have that partner, so it's really not going to work there. But on the other hand, just plinking them with drones isn't necessarily a great idea, and I don't have a great desire to see all my buddies in the special ops community flitting around all over the world trying to hunt these guys down. I don't think there is a really, easy solution to winning this kind of war. But it is a war. It is not a law enforcement issue.
I agree, but I would have a sort of broader critique, and that is I don't believe that attrition is the right way forward at all. Attrition works only if you know the size of the group that you're dealing with, and you just kill them off one by one, and they're gone, right? But these guys are recruiting faster than we can kill them. So and by the way, I also think that this goes along with our false vision of what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a terrorism problem. We're not dealing with a terrorist group. It's always had this political vision. It's always been aspiring to be an insurgency, and it's managed to get there now. So the correct way to deal with it is the long, hard slog of a counterinsurgency. How that looks on a global scale is anybody's guess. And whether that means we, personally, have to have boots on the ground is also anybody's guess. If we were able to empower partners who know the place better than we do and who also want to get rid of these guys as much as we do, if we were training them in counterinsurgency rather than counterterrorism, maybe we'd have a way forward.
But I also worry about what sort of message, for instance, Benghazi sends. The fact that nobody has been held accountable for it. I guess I understand as a former policymaker the desire that potentially I can't channel the Obama administration, nor would they want me to. But perhaps they were worried about taking a drone strike or a surgical strike or in Libya because there are concerns about destabilizing the government. Not that there really is a government to destabilize in many ways. But the fact is that what to me, I mean, I think this is just human nature. What it says to me is that these people can act against Americans with impunity. It's been over. It's almost a year. It's almost a year now, and nobody has been held to account for this. So, what message does that send? How does that motivate people when they feel they can act against American interests with impunity? You know, my sense is that punishment should be swift and just. It's certainly not been swift, and since there's been no punishment, it's not been just. So I think, you know, that's a mistake, and we always talk about it. What you have to do when you look at these problems is you have to open up the aperture of how you're looking at it. Okay, so it's about, you got Benghazi, then you've got Libya, then you've got North Africa, then you've got the Middle East, then you have the global war on terror. How does this affect others if they don't feel like they're going to be held accountable for their actions against American interests? I can only feel that it must be feeling that they can do this. They can continue to do this without being held accountable or doing it with impunity. And I think that's that's the wrong message to send to bad actors like this. So that's what I also worry about in concert with what Mary and Steve have said.
Well, I think a discussion that I think we could continue for another day, probably for a really long time, is to turn this around and look at, Mary talked about what do we know about our enemies. We may be having the wrong image. Well, what do we know about our own government and the way it formulates its policy? Because there could be two versions of this. It could either be that we're bungling all over the place, which, if you don't really understand, that's what it seems like. However, it could also be that, you know, maybe there is some method to madness somewhere, and it would be really nice to explore the systematic approach of behind whatever it is we're seeing, if there is one. I think there might be, but I'm not sure. I think that's much further.
Are you asking a question?
Or
are you commenting?
I'm kind of just commenting. But
well, I think there's something.
Day.
I sense that there are probably some patterns. I mean, quickly before we close here, but there are some patterns, and I think that the Obama administration, I think, generally believes that if we're just nice to these people, whether you're talking about terrorists or North Korea or Iran, they'll be nice back to us. They don't want to be confrontational. They don't want to take on fights that they may be able to slip out of. And I think this is true, not just when we're talking about issues like Benghazi. This is the idea of not being confrontational. I mean, they may have been, I think my sense is they've been mugged largely by reality since then. But remember the president reaching out to Iran after he was inaugurated, his Cairo speech, that if we just talk to these people, if we can just sit down and negotiate with the Iranians about their nuclear program, that they will understand that proliferation is a bad thing. And we don't have to play hardball. Now, they're starting to learn things are different, and I think Libya was one of those sort of things where they felt that they needed to intervene. But this is, I think, the default position, that if we're nice to them, they'll be nice back to us. And don't pick a fight with anybody you don't want to have a fight with. And so if they can, you know, it's, for instance, like in Mali, they let the French do it. I'm not saying that we had to do it, but I'm saying this is, I think, how their calculus works. They let the French do it. So why pick a fight with the folks that were the Al Qaeda groups in Mali, even though some of them had a relationship with what happened in Benghazi? Why? Maybe they'll just stay. Their issues will just be national instead of transnational, and they won't target the United States. And I think this is the default position of this administration. And like I said, in many ways, I think they've been mugged by reality and realize that's not going to work. But I think that's basically how they see things.
Well, that would be a benign explanation. So thank you very much to all of you for coming, and thank you to our great panel.
Thanks.
Stay and have a outside if you can.